Welcome to the #1 show and the source of truth for all things MedTech. Here, we reveal the secrets and stories behind the investments, science, and commercialization of the MedTech industry. Every week, we'll take you on a wild ride with the biggest names in the game, from entrepreneurs and investors who are shaking up the market to healthcare providers who are revolutionizing the way we think and practice medicine. So hold on tight and get ready for a journey like no other. This is the State of MedTech. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. We got another really interesting interview with an exciting startup. So a few months ago, I went to AANS in Los Angeles. AANS is the American Academy for Neurosurgery, one of the shows that I kind of grew up attending along with NAS. And so when I go to these shows, I'm always looking for really cool tech. Unfortunately, having built my career in robotics and AI, it's hard to kind of get me excited. And so I remember going through all the show floor and didn't really see much that was exciting until I came across this one company called Omniscient Neurotech. And I met their founder, Dr. Michael Sughrue. And so what is Omniscient? Let me start by telling you a little bit about them and then about our guest today, who is Dr. Sughrue. So Omniscient, and if you're interested to learn more about them, by the way, you can go to their website, which is beautifully simple, by the way, o8t.com. That's it. So essentially, their purpose is to find the root cause of brain health problems that have until now really been a mystery. If you think about the brain, and what's interesting is that they have this analogy, very subtle in their website. The brain is very much like the ocean. I think we've only explored something like 10 or 15% of our ocean, and the brain is very much like that, believe it or not. There's a lot about the brain we do not know. It's very much a mystery. And once problems are understood, though, they become a lot more treatable and, more importantly, more preventable. And so what Omniscient does is that they build digital brain maps. So imagine trying to navigate the world without a map, right? You'll probably struggle to find the right way. You might take some wrong turns, bump to something unexpected, probably lost forever. And you might get to your destination, but it won't be without a lot of problems along the way, right? Clinicians and researchers face a very similar challenge when it comes to understanding of brain connectivity. And so at Omniscient, they shed a light on the existence of brain networks and take a deep dive into how they interact with one another and impact our day-to-day life. And so their mission is to improve the lives of billions through brain network data, also known as connectomics, because every brain has a potential to be better. And they help by informing clinicians with smarter decisions about the brain by making sense of complex neural data. And so Omniscient did a demo for me at their booth. They essentially use artificial intelligence and cloud computing to map all of this out. And it's really amazing to see because, aside from, let's say, its applications in neurosurgery, think about psychiatry. If psychiatrists were armed with connectome data like this, right, to understand how they're mapping treatments to the brain, right? Think about its applications in transcranial magnetic stimulation. For me, post-pandemic, one of the biggest things is that we have a huge mental health crisis, right? And I feel like Omniscient is one of those companies that's going to be able to help provide support for those kind of things. So let me tell you a little bit about our guests. So Dr. Michael Sughrue has a really interesting background. He grew up in a small town in Oklahoma, right? And after going to the University of Oklahoma, decided to pursue medicine. Went and studied medicine in Columbia University, and then he went on to do neurosurgery at the University of California in San Francisco, which, for those who are not familiar with residencies and fellowships, UCSF is one of the top residencies to do anything in, to be honest. From there, he completed a fellowship in Sydney and then went back to serve as the director of the Brain Tumor Center at the University of Oklahoma for 7 years. And then, all of this to say, he really is an expert when it comes to the brain. He later decided and was inspired to start Omniscient Neurotech, which essentially, based on how they describe themselves, is an artificial intelligence startup that's aimed to radically accelerate the evolution of our understanding of human brain disease, mental illnesses, and more importantly, how the brain actually works. So that's going to be the topic of our episode today. And again, I always enjoy talking to founders and clinicians like Dr. Sughrue because there's a little bit of technical discussions we have, clinical discussion, and of course, a lot of really interesting, I would say, esoteric knowledge that we just totally geek out on. We absolutely love. And if you're a clinician listening to this, don't forget that because it's a clinical episode, this allows you to unlock an AMA/PRA Category 1 CME credit. That's right, you're going to get a CME from this. Just be sure to click the link in the show notes below and unlock that CME. And finally, if you are a founder who's looking for help to get their story out, perhaps you're trying to attract investors or maybe even get commercial traction, here at Khateeb & Co. and the State of MedTech, we believe that using network effects at scale, using social media, is probably the best way to do all of those things at once, which is attract investors at scale, drive product adoption, and get commercial traction. So if you're interested to get my help and learn how the State of MedTech and Khateeb & Co. can partner up with you to do lead generation webinars, develop a strong story, get exposure to investors and potential clinical adopters, right? Go ahead and shoot me a message on LinkedIn or send an email to hello@khateebandco.com. That's hello, HELLO, at Khateeb, KHATEEBANDCO.com. And if you're driving and you want something a little bit easier to remember, you can just go to my website, khateebandco.com. Now, let's get on. Welcome back to the show, the State of MedTech. And again, just as a reminder, if you're a clinician, make sure to click the link below and unlock that CME credit for you. You'll get an AMA/PRA Category 1 credit. Just listen to this episode and then take 30 seconds and write down what you learned. So today with me, I have Dr. Michael Sughrue, who is the founder of Omniscient Neurotechnology. I just came back from AANS, the American Association of Neurological Surgery up in LA. And as usual, when I go to these conferences, there's always a lot of cool technology, but nothing that really sort of catches my eye. And so it's been a couple of conferences that it's been like this. And so Omniscient got on my radar because a friend of mine who's working over there told me about it. I stopped by the booth. I was really impressed. And so Dr. Sughrue and I spent about an hour talking about all things tech, and I just had to have him on the show. So Dr. Sughrue, thanks for joining us today. How are you doing today?
Yeah, good. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Before we talk about the company, maybe a little bit of background on yourself. Where'd you grow up? You are a neurosurgeon. So tell us a little bit about your education and training, and we'll kind of dive right in.
Well, I grew up in Oklahoma originally, and I actually went to the University of Oklahoma, and then went to medical school at Columbia, became a neurosurgeon by training at UCSF, and then I went back to the University of Oklahoma for about 6.5 years, where I ran the brain tumor program. And that while I was there, I got really into brain mapping, specifically because I was doing most of the awake brain surgery in the state. And what I realized really quickly was that the maps of the human brain that we were using to operate were a lot of things we were taught in medical school were just not accurate, or they were not complete. And so patients woke up with problems that I didn't understand why they had them. And that was really frustrating. And more importantly, when you're a resident, you really only focus on getting the patient healthy and out of the hospital. And after that, whatever happens, right? Because you're busy enough just taking care of the inpatient setting. When you become an attending physician, you see these people for a lot longer. And what you realize is that they're not all cognitively normal after that surgery. So they look fine, but they're not fine. And we know that's true with a lot of other problems like traumatic brain injury, et cetera. And so I became really interested in how do we really work out the anatomy of the human cognitive system, and how do we treat these problems and take them seriously, because they're just epic problems.
Got it. And, just real quick, you mentioned doing awake neurosurgery. For those who are not in the neurosurgery realm, what does that mean?
Well, oftentimes when you talk about things like the language system, particularly when there's a tumor in the brain recognizes that something weird is happening. And it sometimes, if you're lucky, moves things out of the way of the tumor. But sometimes it doesn't happen. And these systems, while there's consistency, like, certain parts of the brain tend to do language, it's not the exact same in everyone. And so in order to figure out what you can do, what you can't do, you have to keep the patient awake. The brain doesn't have pain, so you can keep someone awake while you do the surgery, and you stimulate parts of the brain while they're doing things like talking or sometimes more complicated things.
I think on Instagram, there's that one famous video of a violinist playing their violin while they're having brain surgery.
Yeah, there's a lot of them. Actually, if you go into the archives of things on local news, we've had someone play a mandolin as well.
Oh, nice.
Because and I one time had a mechanic assemble auto parts. The answer is we don't know what part of the brain does those specific things, but what we do know is that it's a highly complicated task that requires a lot of things. So at the very minimum, if someone can still do that while you finish removing a part of their brain, then you know you haven't done something terrible. But we're still learning how the brain does these really complicated things.
Yeah, and at least I've heard that the brain is very much like I guess like our oceans, which is like we've only really discovered and explored like 10% of it. Is that true?
It's hard to put a number on it, but what I'll say is I'll give a simple thing that's very sobering, right? So if you look at the connections of the brain at the microscopic level, right? So you look at, say, you go do electron microscopy and slice the brain really thin, and then try to use a computer to recalculate everything. The last I heard on this, the amount of time it took to sequence 1 cubic nanometer of cortex, or 100 cubic nanometer, was 10 to the ninth hours. So they spent 8 years sequencing the fruit fly connectome. I think it's over an exabyte of data, which is like more data than the whole world has accumulated up till 1998 in all forms. So like songs, books, computer programs, everything. So it's a massive amount of data, and that's over 10,000 times simpler than the human brain, and at least that much smaller. And it actually has no relevance to the human brain. The flies and humans diverged and made brains in a totally different way.
Interesting.
So the answer is we probably don't have computers in the world to really work out that detail. And even if you did, the chance that number one, that you would be the same as everybody is impossible. It's just too many data points. And the second is that you would probably be different the next day. And that's assuming we could, kill you, slice you, do the sequencing, bring you back to the dead, let you go a couple of days and do it again, which of course is impossible and unethical. So it's a really, really daunting problem. And to put in perspective, the European Union set out to have a 10-year mission a few years ago called the Human Brain Project, where they were going to try to tackle this. And after a few years, they came back to the reality that they should focus their efforts on having better tools and making this possible. Because right now, it's just not probably possible. What makes this actually tractable is that on the macro scale, a lot of times what things happens at the micro scale can be, you can gloss over it a little bit. You can simplify, make some simplifying assumptions that seem to be pretty good, and you can get really close to understanding. But even that is extremely data. Even taking an fMRI and making it make sense is very, very data intensive. And until we had cloud architectures and machine learning, we just couldn't tackle things like this.
Interesting. Yeah, and that makes it makes a lot of sense too. And what's fascinating is that, at least for maybe I'm biased about this, but I feel like in the last 5 years, there's been a big explosion about new frontiers in neuroscience in the brain, specifically with precision brain medicine, which is what you guys focus on. You used a word earlier that was I've never heard it, and I've been in the space for a while. You said connectomics, I believe, correct? What is that? We talked about this, but I know that a lot of people who are listening to this are like, what the heck is that?
So it's an omics, right? And it was originally coined, I believe, by a guy named Olaf Sporns. But the concept is this: a genome or a proteome. They're widely used in medicine. And what they refer to is the entire set of all genes or the entire set of all proteins in a specific situation. And so connectome is the entire set of all connections in the brain. And thus connectomics is the method of using machine learning and other tools to make that make sense and understand it, right? So if I just give you a list of all 22,000 genes you have and say, here you go, go do medicine with that, it's not useful, right? It's just too much information. And how do you know what's relevant and all these sort of, because humans, we struggle about 4 dimensions, and that's a 22,000 dimensional math problem at the end of the day. Well, if you get to the connectome, this is a orders of magnitude worse. So if you think about the connectome, when we spit out our connectomes, we're looking at 144,000. So we're at least 5 times more. And remember that there's different frameworks. It could be structural, like the 2 areas physically connect to each other, or it could be functional, which is these 2 areas talk to each other, but they're not connected to each other. And those interloop. And that gets even more complicated. But without these kind of tools, we can't make sense of the brain. And this is why we've struggled for so long in areas like mental health, because there isn't a tumor. There isn't a part of the brain that's missing. It's not a obvious problem. But we know that when we look and use connectomics, these things become visible and they start to make sense. And we're starting to really untangle some of these things and make them make a lot more sense than they did 10 years ago.
Got it. So essentially, you're doing awake neurosurgery. You're having to manage these patients more long term. They're still having issues that you didn't know, how to deal with. Um, I think everybody understands this, but like just to kind of state the fact that like being a neurosurgeon, like you're in an academic hospital, which means like you're doing research, you're doing cases, you're already really busy. How the hell did you find time to decide I'm going to start a company? Like how did that all come about?
Well, it actually came down to one of these things where you look around and you say, this is something that really, really needs to get done. And there's no one else signing up to do it. So I'll do it, right? I can throw that on my back. I'm a neurosurgeon. We're kind of a different breed. We're like the Navy SEALs, if you will, because it's such a hard job that only certain types of people sign up for that. One of the things that for me is I started going to meetings to just learn, right? I just wanted to learn how to do a better job taking care of patients. And what I realized is that a couple things. Number one, that the neuroimaging space had absolutely exploded. What they were talking about credibly and doing was incredible. And it really was a major, major step forward when we started to understand that there were parts of the brain that did these cognitive areas, and we understood that how important they were. And we as neurosurgeons didn't even know about this. It was going off in different meetings that we didn't talk about. And ultimately, I looked at this and said, this has the possibility to literally change the world. That's how substantial what's being found here. So I'll give an example. There are two major axes of networks. There's an active network of your brain, and there's a inactive or task negative network called the default mode. And they're always alternating. So you think about it, you don't notice that because it's happening so fast that you think of it just as how you think. But there's a part of your brain when you think to yourself and a part of the brain when you're not thinking to yourself, you're doing something active. And they're not supposed to be on at the same time. Well, it turns out that a lot of mental health issues can be directly linked to crosstalk when they're talking inappropriate. And that's a huge finding. And it's a huge finding that you can actually do things to start to separate them out, and that's actually therapeutically helpful. Well, we didn't have tools that did that. Like, it's good to me to talk this kind of high level stuff, but if you don't have a tool that actually does this and actually works, then it's not useful. I can teach you all sorts of science at the end of time. It's just fascinating stuff. But if we're going to actually help with the lives of patients, we have to do it. And one of the problems I found was that there's great stuff being done, but it was level of code. You had to basically code it yourself. And I talked to people, and there was this kind of idea that they were going to scale, PhD experts at all these hospitals to run these really complex analyses. And I thought, well, that's never going to get paid for. That's never going to work. And it's never going to work fast enough. And what that means is that we're never going to hit the scale of, if you think about depression being tens of millions of people or Alzheimer's being millions of people, how are we going to do that if we have to do everything by hand? And so I looked around and I just said, this needs to get done. No one's doing it. And this is a problem. This is a sad thing for humanity. One of the things the thing that really forced me to act was a couple of years ago, I was watching, I think it was a podcast, if I remember right. But bottom line is that a statistic was thrown out that I verified that this teenage adolescent suicide rate in young women had tripled in the last decade.
Yeah, I believe that.
That's
you want to know my theory as to the variable or the catalyst that contributed to that? Instagram.
Social media.
Yeah, Instagram. Yeah, specifically Instagram.
Well, here's my take on that, though. Right? Yes, that's an exacerbator. It's a stressor, right? But number one, it doesn't kill everyone who it touches, so it can't be the only cause.
That's a very good point.
And the second is that healthy brains don't contemplate suicide. So while it may have been a stressor, what we have to remember is that every suicide, when we talk about, well, what caused so-and-so to commit suicide? Ultimately, we have to look at it and say, yes, something might have driven them into a stressful situation. We know that suicide is a biological process, suicidal ideation. And we know that, for example, people with lower serotonin have more violent suicide attempts, which are much more likely to complete. It's just almost a linear relationship, right?
Is that why usually it's men who commit? Women contemplate suicide the most. Men are the ones who usually carry it out, and obviously in a much more violent way.
Yeah, but it ultimately just comes down to it's something to do with serotonin at the end of the day. Right? And serotonin throws off certain circuits, and the circuits that are involved in this are believed to be resilience against stress. So what happens is, while Instagram may be stressing young women, there's something that also is making it so that they're not resilient in some way, that they can ride out the stress. But because remember, kids in the Blitz were bombed, right? That's got to be stressful. And they didn't all have this tripling of suicide rate that we know of. People have gone through some horrible events in the history of the world, and it didn't end in this kind of
Much worse than like using TikTok or Instagram. That's a good point. That's a fair point. Yeah.
And there's something to do with how the brains of kids are developing that cause this. And we know that a lot of the formative period, or at least there's some data that suggests that the formative period, and we've seen it too in a cohort that we worked with in Singapore, that some of that you can see in the connectome patterns of behavior, of how the brains are developing in people who will go on to be depressed teenagers. And we know if you're depressed as a teenager, it's a much worse problem. It's much less tractable, or much more intractable. And so as a result, there's something that's happening, and I don't know what it is, but there's something that's leaving people less resilient. And more importantly, when you throw this stressor into it, this particular stressor combined with that resilience issue is leading to this problem. Having said that, if we were, that's the same thing. Like, we know that another suicidal rate that has increased significantly is men, particularly older, middle-aged men in areas of the country that are economically depressed, where they can't find work. And that's got, for example, there's a really good BBC documentary on this of suicide rates of men my age and older in Montana and places like that, where, again, that's a very different angle. But ultimately, it comes down to stressors and resilience. Either way, if a serial killer was doing something like this, we would burn the city down to find this person. But we weren't doing that. And it's because it wasn't one person, it wasn't one place, it wasn't one story. But that doesn't make the end result any less terrible.
Isn't that crazy, by the way? Like there's certain diseases that get so much attention and so much money pumped into them. And things like Alzheimer's, depression, where it afflicts millions of people, we kind of just like, it is what it is.
And I'll give you, I can tell you exactly how it is because I've encountered this, right? So if you take, a lot of my patients have glioblastoma, and I've had some patients who are phenomenal advocates who really go out, they want to do this. It's a disease that has a 14-month survival. So when that ends, which is inevitably a lot of people lose their battle with that, then you lose an advocate. You don't have a survivor's march. And the families, it's so bad that they just get tired and they can't keep the fight going. So what happens is you're constantly having, whereas breast cancer has people who survived or people who are living with it.
And thus you have a survivor's march, you have survivor advocacy. Oh, interesting.
Yeah. If you look at stroke or Alzheimer's, they wipe out the people who are affected, right? So no one has it personally. So you might walk for your mom, but at the same time, we kind of also look at that and say that's a disease of aging. Life has an end. And that isn't always true in the situation of it, but that's one of the things. And depression is really simple. It takes people, the entire nature of that disease takes you out of the motivated advocate. And we want patients to be advocates, but it's just the nature of that problem. It almost wipes out your ability to fight it. Whereas breast cancer doesn't necessarily go after your motivation. And there's people who are survived it for years. There's people who are cured of it. So, of course, you have a strong opinion about it. You don't want that to happen to other people. We want cures and treatments. And this is why breast cancer has, dozens and dozens of drugs because of all the research that's gone into it. And other diseases have less. Now, also, there's also just complexity to the problem. Depression is a very, very, very complicated problem. Whereas breast cancer, we have a lot more understanding of the situation. So it isn't all advocates, but that's a big reason for it.
Got it. Now, and the company's name, by the way, is Omniscient Neurotechnology, and you have it as OAT. That's, like your guys' website, I believe, is OAT.com. What's with the OAT?
It comes down to trademarks, but I'll make this an interesting one. So we called the company Omniscient initially because we're a knowledge company, right? So we make software, but it's software that delivers and synthesizes knowledge, because that's really what the big problem in medicine is.
And just so I highlight it, when you say that, just so people have a visual, I do recommend, I'll put the link in the show notes below, but if you go OAT.com, you can see a lot. But essentially, you guys have mapped the brain out, and so when physicians, clinicians are treating it, whether it's in the neurosurgical standpoint or, and we'll get to this in a moment, the psychiatric, you can actually have targeted therapies versus just kind of like throwing therapies with a shotgun approach, So that's why you guys are truly a precision brain code. But anyway, Please continue.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point that while we use our AI type technologies, we kind of view ourselves more as an IA, or instead of being a generative AI, we're a synth AI, where you're synthesizing tons of information for somebody and making it easy to understand. And so one of the things, though, an interesting side note about trademarks. So it turns out that the trademark system in the United States was kind of codified in 1950s, 1960s. I don't know the exact year. But essentially, at that time, computers were in a pretty primitive state. So all computers, all electronics, and all software got put into Class 8. Obviously, things have changed, but they haven't revised that. So currently, the ratio of trademarks in Class 8 to actual words in the English language is like 40-1. So this is why you see all these companies like Uber and Zoom and Noom and all these things, because they're trying to get around trademarks, like have something that they can actually own and defend. In our particular case, there was like one company in Arizona that was called Omniscient Imaging. And even though they make microscopes and we make software, it was close enough where we had to find a way to differentiate it so that we wouldn't take the risk of being hit. And so someone came up with the idea that Andreessen Horowitz did 816Z there for different reasons, so people didn't have to necessarily spell that all out to write the website. But in our case, we just said there's 8 letters between O and T, so it will use the same idea.
And like it.
Yeah. It also the magic formula was O8T was being squatted on by a Chinese group who sold it for a lot cheaper price than most people squatting on websites. So that's but that was that right there. Just 3 weeks of my life spent repeatedly having the lawyers shoot down ideas for trademarks. What's really great was we looked at Connectome, thinking we're the first connectomic company that we know of in the world, and so no one could possibly have trademarked that by now. And it turned out there was a file sharing website called connecttome.com.
Oh,
written as one word. And I was like, wow, this is how bad even the word connectome, which is a fairly new word that has not been commercialized to our understanding, had someone that hit it a different way.
There's something to be said about, I know people who still do it, which is like collecting like domains and just sitting on them until one day somebody wants to pay out for them. But I remember in the early 2000s, like that was a real thing. Like just, people buying like pets.com, princereview.com, just buying anything and everything,
It's probably a significant chunk of the GDP of the Cayman Islands if you actually look at it now.
That's a great point.
Yeah, there's all these people who squatted on almost anything you could. So, and the point is, at least for us, it was a Chinese group that did it, and they weren't looking to make a ton of money off it. So we actually bought it for a few $100.
That worked. So, something that we kind of skipped over by, for the clinicians who are listening to this, because there's a lot of physicians who have great ideas for innovation to solve different problems, but they're kind of like, not everybody's as industrious as you to just kind of go and figure it out on your own. But like, so you recognize a problem, which is we haven't mapped out the brain. We're taking a shotgun approach to things. Patients aren't getting better. So map the brain, develop a software, do it. How did you raise the initial capital for this? Like, how did you do all of that?
Some of it really comes down to the biggest difference that I think happens is, you come from an academic background, right? And what you think about is two things. Number one, whatever you come up with has to be like the level of CRISPR before you commercialize it. It has got to be absolutely world-changing technology, and anything short of that is not worth your time, right? And the answer is, what you find out is that a lot of the most valuable things in the long term are very straightforward solutions to a problem. So I'll give an example. Like, we didn't invent connectomics. There's a lot of research on it right now. It's almost 100,000 papers or something like this. We didn't invent the methods. What we did invent was the software, a technique to show it a certain way that made it useful. And that's very, very valuable IP because it solves the problem. It's not useful without that. And that's really the migration from idea to product. Technology to product. Medical doctors don't think about product because you just think, well, there's a technology in this kind. But what happens is tech and industry is about turning things into products, which is something that someone would be willing to pay for that you can support and service, and that it actually solves a problem that makes it willing to do it, and that you have a way to get it paid for. All that stuff in that process, you have to start thinking about it early, because ultimately, even if you're not necessarily ready to commercialize your product, if no one will ever pay for that solution, the issue is, why would anyone ever, if you're in a situation where why would anyone ever pay for this? Or that it's really going to be hard to actually deliver this in a healthcare setting. for example, some really complex algorithm, and you can't think of how you would service it. I mean, remember, there's companies that do genomic sequencing. They figured out how to do that, but it's not just enough to sequence the genome. How do you get it to your customers? How do you make it so that they understand the value proposition? How do you convince a hospital or a payer or somebody to pay for this? And how do you actually get that to the point of care repeatedly? Those things are not something you learn in medical school. They're people who do product, and you need to get one of those people and a regulatory person in your tent as soon as possible, because it may be that you're not the right person to commercialize it. That's where you would license something to someone else. But
Now,
a lot of times,
I gotta bring up something that I was, to this day, I'm just blown away by, that we had a discussion at the booth, because for the audience, a lot of them know that I went to medical school. So you and I were talking, and I joked with you. I'm like, yeah, this is one of those things that we should have learned like while we were learning the Krebs cycle. And you, in your professional career, credited the Krebs cycle for something important. And I just have to have you just take a quick sidebar and tell me, why the hell did you use the Krebs cycle? Because I called BS on it. I was like, there's no way in hell you use the Krebs cycle for anything of value in clinical practice. And you're like, no, it did. So tell me how you use the Krebs. We're just quick sidebar on this.
Yeah, so I always tell my students, you have to be humble while you're learning, that you may not know what's going to be important. And I said, we used to use the Krebs cycle as the definition of esoteric, non-clinically relevant. And it was that in my career till 2008, when someone published that one of the Krebs cycle proteins being mutated it's been validated beyond any doubt now, that is the dominant mutation in glioma. So
it was alcohol dehydrogenase. You said it was alcohol dehydrogenase.
No, it says isocitrate, IDH. IDH1 mutation is now required by the WHO to be tested in all gliomas. It's actually disease defining. And so if you try to publish a paper with that IDH1, so now we're literally talking about a Krebs cycle protein all the time. Now, to really get into it, you still have to know, like, okay, well, what ends up happening is 2-hydroxyglutarate builds up, and that causes the other things in the cell. And the point of it is, now, granted, do I need to know the rest of the Krebs cycles? To date, no. But it shows you that you just never know what's going to come out of the lab, because and what's going to be important in your career. Like, I would never thought that was part of brain surgery, but it is.
I love it. So, sorry, getting back. So, how did you get started? Like, did you go to an incubator with Omniscient? How did you raise the initial capital?
Well, the big thing we had was myself, my co-founder, and a few other people built a credible prototype. And there's a long, complicated story how that happened. But
is your co-founder a clinician as well?
No, his name's Stefan Doyen, and Stefan and I met while I was in Sydney, and he is has a PhD in neuroscience from Cambridge and Brussels, and he then left because neuroscience kind of has a lot more grad students and they have jobs, and so he went off into industry.
That's so true. I've never heard somebody say that. That's so true. That's such a good point.
It gets down to people can raise a lot more money for having research grants than they can for funding actual startup package. And so as a result, I remember being in the room at OHBM and looking around and saying, at the time I was about 38, and I thought, I am the 10th oldest person in this room of 5,000 people. So some of these people need to be looking for other career paths. There's no way they all have faculty jobs. That's guaranteed, because that's not how the AANS is. It's a very different skew. But going back on the note, he basically worked out in industry and startups and various companies, and was directing Oliver Wyman's AI division in they're a tier 1 consulting company in Asia Pacific. And so I gave him a complicated problem, which is, how do you look at a brain that's distorted and find where languages live? And we had a solution within a few weeks. We built that into a credible prototype by bootstrapping it, basically. And the key point is that de-risked the initial investment, because we said we have something that's getting close to being able to commercialize and credibly get through the FDA. And that allowed us to go to investors and say, well, we've de-risked the technical parts of it. We're not asking for your money to do a science project or build a prototype. We're doing this to harden the software into something that's commerciable and to take it through the FDA and sell it. And that allowed us to raise about $12 million. So we skipped the seed and went straight to that.
Oh, luckily, okay. That explains a lot. Okay, that got who led the, if it's not private, who led the round for you guys?
It's a contingent of Australian high net worth investors. So we met one of them. Our lead investor is a guy named Will Vickers, who's just a phenomenally good guy. And he basically, from the beginning, said, "This seems like it's something that's really important, and the world should have this. And we need you to get this together and turn this into a company that we can invest in. We can't invest in just software and two guys." So we got together a leadership team, including a guy who was named Steve Sheeler, who was a high early exec at Facebook when they were in their scale-up period. And we basically started whipping this into a company. He then got together a group of other, and now it's many of the richest people in Australia have invested. And the angle on it was all of them. It hit them right at home, because they all had Alzheimer's in the family. They all had mental illness, and they knew what we're talking.
Do you feel like that's going to be, for me, I deal with a lot of startups raising money and everything, and for VCs, like, they have LPs to make happy and everything, and so sometimes these moonshot it's not even a moonshot, but they want to look for things that have commercial traction. Do you feel like the future of at least neurotech is going to be focused on going straight to family offices, wealthier private investors and everything, who are going to invest it as a social good and just say, hey, we're going to fund it, we're going to give you money, and then just do what you got to do. We're not going to worry about like a commercial exit right away?
I think that's absolutely what has to happen for some of this stuff, because some of these things are not easy, and they're going to take maturity. And if what you want to do is sell something to Medtronic because you have a new catheter, that kind of investment thesis doesn't work with this, right? I mean, If you look at building brain machine interface, it takes a while to figure it out. I think one of the big questions has to be, when is it really ready to leave the lab? And that's really the question, right? And in our case, it's extremely mature tech, right? We don't know everything about how the human brain works, but we know that where the default mode network is located, how to image it. That's no question. There's still a lot of translational things, like, well, okay, what specific way do you do this? And how do you make sure that it's reproducible and works on every scanner in the world? Those are industry problems, not lab problems necessarily, of how to do it at scale. But what you get down to is there's a fine line between when is something something that should be funded by NIH, it's high risk, unstructured, etc., versus when it should enter the VC world. But you're still going to have difficult problems to tackle in medicine in general. And so what we end up doing is thinking all we're going to do is make a dural substitute and get it into market to compete with someone else. Well, there's a role for that, but that's just not going to what moves the needle. And what I found is that when you walk around exhibit halls and you see Me Too products, nobody gets excited, right?
No, I definitely don't.
Yeah. And what happens is, in our case, we grew from FDA clearance to having a group of zealotous people who really believe in this, who have built their own organization all around it with only a slight bit of assistance from us, because everyone looks at this and says, this is the future of our field. And that's what we've seen with psychiatrists when we started showing them our latest stuff. Everyone realizes that in there is the future. Mm-hmm. And you're not going to do that by basically taking A and making A prime. You're going to do that by looking at A and saying A is totally inadequate. We need D. And that's 5 steps down the road. And it may take a while to work out D. And the bigger issue is when you bring D to the clinicians, at first they're not even going to know what to do with it because it's so different.
Right.
And so you need a med ed program. You need to spend time with people. You need to teach people how to do it and then get them to teach other people how to. So, for example, focus ultrasound is another good example of this. It's a technology that is going to change our field. It is already doing it. But it just isn't going to immediately, the day you roll out your first one, it isn't that every hospital is going to buy that. And so it's not the right investment for people who what they want to see is an immediate 20x return in 3 years. It's just not that stage. But someone's got to fund that. I mean, otherwise we never get these technologies. And it's a difficult loop. We're not quite in that level of focus ultrasound, but over time those things become, large commodities that make lots of money, but they're not going to do it in 2 years.
Yeah, it makes sense. And, I think at least for neurotech, it seems like more like the early days of Amazon approach, which was like, Amazon the first 10, 15 years was not profitable, but, Jeff Bezos's like message to the market. There's actually this famous Jay Leno clip where Jay's like, okay, your company's worth billions of dollars, but you're losing money. But he's like, look, we're really reinvesting and betting on the future here. And obviously that worked out really well. And I think that's the same case, like with really transformative medical technologies, like it's going to take a certain type of investor with a higher pain threshold to just kind of stick to it and fund, versus I feel like a lot of investors, and not that this is a bad thing, they're looking for they've been spoiled by SaaS with these like huge 50x, 100x returns that are done within like a period of like 5 years, and taking a med device to market costs money. You know,
Sometimes you see these companies who will approach us and say, "Hey, we want to give you some new leads," and I said, "Oh, really? You're going to go in and teach connectomics to neurosurgeons? Good luck with that one. That's our marketing, like, and it's complicated." I think the other thing about it is, medtech is, again, it's notoriously slow but big booms, right? So if you look at Moderna, it took them 10 years to get a clearance, but that seemed to have done pretty well, right? And it's because you're in this massive. Once you've proven yourself, you're in a massively inelastic market, and you
it's
don't have
very very
competitors.
blue ocean too.
Yeah, and look at it this way. Do you think that anyone sat there and had a hard negotiation with Moderna over their vaccine? Moderna told China to go, stick it over intellectual property transfer requirements. Why? Because they could, right? They could. Everyone needed that vaccine, and the next time a pandemic happens, that's going to be where it is too, and a lot of other things, because we know mRNA vaccines are a revolutionary technology. And I think what we get to is, ultimately you have to find the right mindset of investors. And so while there are obviously some products that just, this is another IV catheter that's better than the other IV catheter and it's going to turn this much money, and you also have to have some people who think long term, and that they can't just be seed investors, because some of this stuff is expensive.
No, it makes a lot of sense. So let's go over to the application. So you're a neurosurgeon, but we talked a lot about was the application of Omniscient's technology and platform in the field of psychiatry, which I think is really interesting. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, let me do a screen share, because I think that's actually the easiest way
you can do screen share. And for those who are listening on Apple, I'm sorry you're not going to be able to see this, but you can go over to YouTube or Spotify where you have the full video.
Well, hopefully I can convey this in knowledge.
Look at that, man! You have the deck and everything ready to go. I love it. I'm going to send this episode to other guests and be like, this is how prepared you should do this kind of stuff.
Well, when you give 4 talks a week every week, you start to have some material. So if you think about it this way, right? There's 2 big problems in psychiatry, right? If you get down to it, and this isn't my opinion, this is their opinion that I'm basically characterizing. So one of the problems is that if I try to give someone an MDD diagnosis for major depression, I'm basically take a list and I say, do you meet these things on the list? Well, these lists were made by very smart people who were trying to organize drug trials many years ago and make sure we had objective numbers. But the problem is, we know that there's so much overlap between ADHD, and that's why people show up and they get 7 diagnoses on the first visit, right? You get that because none of those diagnoses really exist per se. They have another diagnosis that's different, and they have parts of different combinations of disease. But the other problem is that there's lots and lots of types of depression. There's at least 4. There's probably a lot more than that. And so what happens is, I'll give you an example. If you take the DSM, it's possible to have 2 people to have depression. One of them is suicidal, crying, feels guilty about everything in life. And the other one has no energy, nothing makes them feel good, and they have trouble concentrating and sleeping. Those sound like entirely different problems, right? But they technically both meet the same diagnosis. And the problem is that because there's so much overlap between these different things, it's hard to use clinical criteria to set it up.
And they essentially get treated the same way, right?
Correct.
Like literally with treatment,
Well, the point is, this is the equivalent of putting a cast on everyone's right arm, because that helps sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Well, everyone else with a different broken bone is not getting the right treatment, and it doesn't work. And this is why they have a 40% success rate, right? It's pretty good. That's better than 0. And remember, before then they were doing frontal lobotomies and ECT, right, for everything. So ultimately, what the problem though is that when you get down to it, we do not have enough people to handle the mental health crisis the way we're doing. It's not possible. And part of the reason is, if a psychiatrist sees a patient, they have to take a history. 25 minutes is efficient. Then they've got to convince the patient a lot of times that they have the problem that they think they do and build the relationship. That could take a long time, even years. And people personality disorders never agree that they have them. And then you start the therapy if you start it, right? And this is the same whether you're doing CBT, whatever you're doing. And so you have to do that over and over and over again on a problem of that's 25, 30% of the population, with a field that only has a ratio of psychiatrists to general practitioners or people with mental illness of like 8,000 to 1. That's just not doable, right? So what ends up happening is we have family medicine, but even that, if you're doing something inefficiently because you don't have objective tests to shortcut some of this stuff and just get to the point. This would be like me sitting there having a long discussion with you to try to figure out what your blood sugar is. and diagnose you with diabetes. That's really inefficient compared to just sticking the finger. So ultimately, people are trying to scale this with tech. But of course, one of the things is chatbots can obviously have the challenges we see with AI. But the reality is you still have a manpower limitation, right? And you still have that. So one of the things we started working on is how do we think about the problem differently? And the best way to improve efficiency isn't to organize the problem a different way. It's to actually change the problem. And so what we know, for example, if you look at the upper left, is that different parts of the brain that are not next to each other fire in sync for periods of time. They're not exactly synchronized, but they're very close. And we can quantify. If you look in the middle, this is our pipeline that can actually measure every single connection and every single correlation between two areas. And what happens is this is the process of mapping a connectome. So you look at areas and different parts of the brain are firing at different time points to cover different cognitive functions. What happens is that if you and I are laying in a scanner, assuming neither one of us have a disease or a mental illness, there's certain things that are going to be different because you're thinking about your podcast and I'm thinking about baseball or whatever. But there's certain things that are very consistent, like the motor system and the visual system talk amongst themselves very often. And mentally ill people have things that happen in their connectome that don't happen in normal people. They're just things that are too correlated or not correlated. And if you map that for the whole brain, you find very complicated patterns. But using AI, you can actually start to make sense of them. And so the NIMH started to take the field into this area of saying, listen, let's not put labels on it. Let's just say that there are normal functions like the reward system. So something good happens, you feel good about it. Or a system that called reward effort. When you predict how likely is something good going to happen and how much work is it going to take and how much work am I willing to do it? Well, if that system is off, no matter how good it is, you're not going to do it because you don't have motivation. And that's a common problem in depression and other diseases. But you can also have it through schizophrenia. You can have it through head injury. And that's called the transdiagnostic approach, where we don't try to make a diagnosis. We just talk about the circuits and we focus on the circuits. What we basically built is a concept that says we can start to take the symptoms and figure out what circuits are the likely culprits. Because we now start to know where in the brain these things happen from lots of research. And why that's revolutionary is right now what we do is we say, well, hey, these people have these things in common, so they all have the same diagnosis. But then the problem is there's a lot of things that they don't have in common. And it's almost an infinitely complex problem. And we're asking psychiatrists to solve this problem without any objective tests. And so what we started doing is saying, let's just look at the circuits. Let's look at how they talk to each other because we know who the circuits are. We've mapped a lot of these. And we can start to look at areas that are firing out of sync and quantify them. And what we get is we get a test that basically looks at the patient's circuits and says, well, you said you have this and you do or do not have an actual problem with that circuit. And then we can begin to do therapy based on it. Now, obviously, we can think about more complicated things like, stimulation and things. But ultimately, the first thing it does, if you look in this one, the left is what you see in a normal person in the fear circuit. Now, you see the fear circuit's complicated. It's a lot of parts. But the flag colors, the white ones are areas that are basically behaving normally, and the flag colors are outliers. Well, in a normal person, you might see a few, but that person on the right was literally having a panic attack in the scanner. And you can see that the circuit has gone nuts. There's lots of abnormality in that particular time. But what if that's your circuit all the time? Well, you're prone to having panic attacks, right? Anything can trigger it. And that's the problem. Well, one, you could put electrodes, brain-machine interface. We could think of drugs. There's different ways you can try to normalize a circuit. But the simplest one is CBT works if you are actually aiming at the right problem, and there's 100 different ways to do therapy. So what we can do is we can take ChatGPT, take all the circuits you have, we make a modified version of it, and then we can basically design a therapy plan that actually hits all of the circuits that are actually wrong in them. We don't even need to know what their diagnosis is. It's irrelevant. We just go straight to the circuits.
Interesting.
And so what you can imagine is what happens is instead of having this long discussion, we just go straight to the test. We have you take a survey. We make a bunch of therapies that are aimed at reward prediction circuits. And there's a circuit called reward satiation when it says you've had enough. Well, when that doesn't work, you either overeat or you binge and purge. That's bulimia. That's one of the core problems. Or you get prone to doing too much drinking or drugs. It's part of a lot of diseases, right? And this is why a lot of people who have mental illnesses have drug problems. It's the same thing. It's ultimately the circuits. So what we do is we design a therapy using generative AI that makes a novel therapy. And that lets you go a lot faster because you get to the point quicker. And that lets you work with people who are not necessarily board certified psychiatrists because we have to extend and lets them behave as super psychiatrists. But ultimately, when you get down to it, is the core thesis is that if you're smarter, you work faster and do better care. So that doesn't matter what disease you're treating. And so we've made models. We have about 120,000 brain with data on who these patients are, whether that got better or not, et cetera. And what we've been trying to do is just turn it into tools that actually solve a problem that actually improves medicine. That's kind of our business. Going into the discussion of having long horizons, right? And in the current cap market, there's been this big forced austerity that's happened to everybody, right? Everyone in tech. And for someone like Facebook or some company doing CRM software, this means, well, we don't have as many social media managers doing X or Y. But when you're talking about med tech, this is, well, we're not educating people how to use these technologies. And while that's happening, while we're having this kind of austerity measures and cutting costs and all these things, what that means is that's a longer time before one more person gets treatment, And if you think about it, when we have a 40% rate of failure, and we know that if you fail your first two medicines, the chance that a third medicine is going to help is 5% or less. So we need to start thinking about other things. If these technologies come 2-3 years later, people dying, right? And that's one of the downsides of having the tech sector austerity, which is, there was probably some rampant spending in Silicon Valley, right? I mean, we're going off and doing the metaverse before it's ready for prime time, or we're
that was
hiring for
that VC hype cycle that went from like crypto to metaverse to generative AI in like 18 months is just insane. I can't wait to see the next thing that they go on to. But sorry, continue.
But generative AI is kind of the real deal, right? I mean, at least ChatGPT is a big deal. We all know that, right? But
it is, but I feel like, because I use it on a daily basis, I feel like ChatGPT right now is like an idiot savant. Some things I'm like, man, this thing is unbelievable. It's just a genius. Other things I'm like, man, this thing is an idiot. So I feel like it's still not there yet, but for what it can do, it's unbelievable though. It is insane. Well, I don't think it's gonna take a single person's job though, believe it or not.
I think here's the thing I heard on it was, we talked to our development team and we said, is this going to make everyone into 10x developers? And they said, it's going to make the 10x developers 20x, and it's going to make the 1x employer hard to find jobs. I do think that's going to happen.
I agree. I totally agree.
Because what it is this, right? In the past, I would have to go spend a lot of time writing IRB protocols and hire people to look up papers and things that were just, it requires a certain level of education, but it doesn't require my level of education. And now I can kind of just do that a lot faster. One of the things that it actually really is good for is looking up papers from the 1980s on like rat studies or something that I couldn't find in the past.
Yeah, it just accelerates time. I think that's the big thing, because that's the one asset that only goes one way. And I think even like look, when generative AI came out, like the first thing people were like, oh, graphic designers are going to be gone. No, if anything, they're going to be. It's just like when computers were brought out and librarians are like, oh, we're all going to lose our jobs. It actually created more librarian jobs because somebody needs to manage this stuff. Like now that generative AI is out there, I mean, I'm a business owner. I'm not going to go and spend time like, prompting an AI to come up with a new logo or some kind of design. Like the designer's going to do that. They're just going to be a lot more efficient at their job and they're going to be better at it. I think. Would you agree with that?
It's to an extent. I think the one thing is, a couple of years ago there was a real article. It was I believe he's a social economist of some kind, and he was from MIT, and called "On Bullshit Jobs." And basically said there's all these jobs. That
that's a great. Is that a podcast or a blog?
I think it was in like the Atlantic or something. But
that's I gotta look into that. Okay. Sorry, continue.
Yeah. So anyway, he said, I've written stuff for 25 years and nothing has ever struck a chord like this. Like he got invited, the speaker circuit, all this stuff. And basically what it was is the idea was that there were all these jobs out there that didn't have a need to exist. So like, we pay teachers and nurses not what they're worth in our society, which is a terrible thing. But there's no question to a teacher that what they do is important, right? Mm-hmm. No question. There's no question nurses, what they do is important. We see these things. We see that what happens when society is forced to go inside, who really matters and who's kind of just, not to say everyone who went inside but didn't matter, because obviously I was one of those people. But the answer is what you realize is there's all these people whose job it is to like, redline corporate contracts. And now maybe you don't need that anymore, right? Because you can get one person to do the job of 5 people. So that's the people I think are going to be most at risk, is people who are superfluous. But having said that, of course, what you can do, just like, social media generated all these people whose job my for example, my 2-year-old watches this show called Like Nastia, and she's apparently making $62 million a year doing, children's programming. I'm like, I went in the wrong job, obviously.
Seriously,
That was
yeah.
completely created out of YouTube, right? So yeah, YouTube made certain types of media obsolete or at least difficult to maintain, but it all of a sudden opened up a whole different industry.
Yeah, these platforms, what's exciting about them is like we have no idea the network effect that they're going to have on job creation. It's kind of like in the 1900s when they introduced like highways and superhighways. We knew that it was going to have an effect on transportation. We had no idea how it was going to, bring like fast food, all these other things that had like a ripple effect. I feel like, I mean, look, YouTube's a great example of that, right? I mean,
Well, and that's one of the things we think about ourselves as in the long term, right? So right now, it's not that if you look at mental health care, right, it's notoriously underfunded. It's like psychiatry is
yeah,
notoriously
that was like the number
overlooked,
one
especially.
issue that came out of the pandemic, and like nobody's really talking about it much, right?
Well, I think what it gets down to is you have to think about the industry has fundamentally changed. And a good example, there's a wonderful Vice documentary on this about healthcare, mental health care in China. But I think it's true to the U.S. extent as well. And they said one of the things that happened after the pandemic in China was it went from nobody talked about mental health unless you needed to be in the hospital. And that's what the system was scaled for, too. All of a sudden, it became like the West overnight. Like China always adopts everything at the end result of the U.S.'s technological cycle. And so now there's this huge, their ratio of psychiatrists to people in the population is one psychiatrist for every 165,000 people. And given that a third of those people would probably have some kind of mental health issue, you're talking about enormous, impossible ratios to fill, and how the private sector all of a sudden has exploded to fill the gap. One of the things we think about when we think about mental health is, let's say we were to look at the bell curve, and that bell curve was human happiness is the x-axis, and on the right are like Buddhist monks who can burn themselves and don't worry about it, and then on the left side is like people who are institutionalized throwing their feces at guards in the prison, right? We were only really we're only setting up the healthcare for the left side of that tail. So that's what we funded, and we don't fund it very well, right? But we fund enough of it, and then there's some through the industry insurance sector. But are they really going to pay for people to feel perfect? No, they're not going to do that, and they've shown us they're not going to do that because they know depression patients can't fight back. It's hard to go to court if you're depressed and sue Blue Cross for 10 years, right? People do that for their kids' cancer. They don't do that for their depression, and they've known that. So if you think about it, you say, what if you rethought the industry is this is like plastic surgery. It's elective. It's basically, people get boob jobs to feel better all the time, and they spend $5,000 for it. Why wouldn't you basically be willing to do that to get out of misery? And patients are absolutely willing to do that. Increasingly, psychiatrists are going to cash pay models.
I totally agree. Sorry, finish your thought. I have to share something.
And that's a whole different industry, and it's a very good industry. And what that means is that you say, hey, let's just realize that the payers don't want to pay for it and won't. And we look at the payer system as, let's make sure there's a safety net for the very sickest people because we are obligated to do that as a civilized society. But everyone else who can pay probably would be willing to do it, right? Because what else are you spending your money on?
That's no, 100%. And look, I'm going to get a little personal. I'm very open book about this. Well, I'm going to be open book about it now. Let me give you my scenario and this concept that like if people are more than willing to pay cash for like plastic surgery, they'll be willing to pay for things for mental health. So for me, I've used mental health services in the past where either through insurance or on my own dime, right? Because I'm a big believer in cognitive behavioral therapy, psychiatry, these things, and using them before you have a major issue. So for me, 10 plus years ago when I was in medical school, I was, somebody who, as a child, diagnosed with ADHD, didn't really use medication until high school, college, went on Ritalin, then Concerta, so on and so forth. And for like a solid 12 plus years, right? Until last year, I was on, I believe, a very high dose of Vyvanse. And I noticed that I was having trouble falling asleep, right? And so at night I had to use like some other medication. It was like, I think I used buspirone or an anti-anxiety just to help me fall asleep. I was more irritable and tense around my family. And the big indicator was like, I was starting to hallucinate a little bit. Like I would go out at night and I'd feel like something was around me. So all those things made me realize like, you know what? I think I'm going to stop this cold turkey. So I literally didn't I was having a hard time getting a hold of my psychiatrist because it's all telemedicine. So I just cut cold turkey. That was really, really hard, brutal.
Yeah.
But, and this is back in October, but within like a matter of 2 weeks, like that was really tough. And I don't recommend people do this at all. I'm just a guy with a podcast. It's not health advice. But, I felt like I got my creativity back. I was a lot more calmer and everything. Great. Fast forward to today. Now I'm still kind of managing, like, am I as effective as I used to be? Because I did like the feeling when I was on these medications. Because when you're hopped up on amphetamines, like you're just like, you just work, right? So I don't have that anymore. And then recently, just side note, I injured my back. And so I've been like rehabilitating. And so my workout hasn't been there. But the last like month or two, when I wake up, I don't wake up at 5 a.m. anymore. Usually it's like 6 or 6:30. I roll out of bed and I don't feel as motivated. And so I'm like, part of me, I'm like, I don't think I'm depressed, but something's different, right? And I've resisted going to like, to psychiatry because their thing is just like, let's just throw some medication at it. And so if there's ways for me to like pay out of pocket, it's like, I'm going to go get a scan. We're going to use something like Omniscient to sort of map out like what's going on. And then I could pay for some kind of procedure like transcranial magnetic stimulation or something. As an entrepreneur, there's thousands of entrepreneurs I know who are out there who pay a lot of money for like coaching, self-development, these kind of things, including medications and drugs. Cause like we see this as like a sport. So it's like, these are performance enhancers. So anyways, this is a big, long tangent, but I absolutely love where you're going with this. Sorry, please jump in on that.
Let me dive into meds. And again, this is not, I'm the opposite of a person who's going to go on some, rage against the machine tangent about psychotropic medicines. I think they're life-saving for people.
I think they're life-saving too. You should use them when you need to. I'm not anti-med, but yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah. But one of the things to think about though, is there's some limits to how they work, right? So if you look at the neurotransmitters in the brain, there's about, depending on how you define a neurotransmitter, somewhere around 180 of them. I actually spent time going through this with ChatGPT, by the way.
180 neurotransmitters.
Yeah, but most of them are widely expressed throughout the brain. They're used everywhere, or they're used only in the hypothalamus to measure hunger or something. So if you get what makes the serotonin and dopamine systems modulable is they're in some places but not others. But the answer is they still are going to. The way to think about it is, let's say for example, you're running the power plant in a big city like Los Angeles. And your friend calls you and says, I don't know where I'm at, but this hotel I'm at doesn't have power. Lights are flickering. And you say you've got only one switch to turn up the juice everywhere, turn it down, or you could turn it on in one part of the city, say this neighbor. Well, you might get more power to your friend, but you might have other effects, and you may not make it to him because it's just the wires cancel out because you don't know exactly where he's located. Well, the difference is precision treatments are you find where your friend's located and you turn up the juice at that place or you fix the wiring. That has some immense potential. But for example, if you look at the situation you're looking at, let's look at amphetamines, norepinephrine, and those analogs like epinephrine. What they do is in certain parts of the brain, they turn up the signal to noise ratio. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now that's good. You make sense. You get less noise and you get more efficient conduction in certain networks that are involved in attention.
Can I insert an analogy I heard a few weeks ago that I like a lot? Essentially with these drugs, it's either allowing you to press the gas more or press on the brakes. Would you agree with that analogy?
Well, yes, exactly. Because what it does is it's more clean signal in one circuit.
Mm-hmm.
So the interesting thing is, why would you ever not want that? Why don't you always want an efficient circuit? And it turns out that when you have an efficient circuit, it closes out other noise, right? So other lesser, important connections don't get to weigh in on the decision. That's how it improves attention, right? Having said that, the problem with that is sometimes you want other people weighing in, and you want that when you're building memories, when you build long-term relationships between complex parts. And so what you're talking about creativity, it prevents anything else from weighing in and building these kind of interconnections. So yeah, you're an efficient machine, but you don't integrate as much. And so that's an interesting problem, and it's hard to titrate something that complicated with a pill. That's really what it gets down to. And even if you wanted to find where the happy medium was, what are we titrating, right? Titration involves having an objective endpoint. How do you titrate the med if you don't have an endpoint? Well, circuits are a good endpoint, right? I mean, you say titrate until the circuit looks good, and then look at other circuits that it might affect and make sure they are not affected.
So how does that
optimize?
How does that look like in practice? So I want to get to this in a moment because we do have investors who listen to the show. So you guys have been commercial for a year and a half. Are you okay to share your more or less your revenue to date, or you prefer to keep that private?
We're open about it. So right now we expect by the end of this year we should have 3 million ARR, and we're adding about 1 million a quarter.
Got it. That's
That's
and for
selling
the
it. That's
it, and for the non-SaaS audience, AR is annual recurring revenue. So it's a software model. That's a SaaS business model. So 3 million in AR end of the year. You're adding 1 million per quarter. Okay.
Yes, part of it is that it took us a while to get to the point where we navigate into just hospital ITs. They're actually the bane of any SaaS company in existence because
People
they have
who
no
regulated to the basement in the last like 5-10 years have just been given an insane amount of power and influence in the hospital.
Oh yeah, no, and they have no incentive. They don't get. They don't. There's nothing that
It's
incentivizes
just
them to
more
be
work.
efficient.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's more work for them. So like they're incentivized to shoot stuff down all the time. You know.
Yeah, and so for us, we navigate them fine, but they're just slow, and that takes a while to get. So for example, there's accounts that have actually become experts and taught courses before the IT people approve the software, because we've worked around that. We've started to work on a per case basis and things like this. One of the things, though, is we're launching our psychiatric product this year. That's not in the AR projections, but that has the potential, we think, to be much more explosive.
So what you just described was was the ARR that you have to date is through neurosurgery.
That's it, yeah, and in the hospital. So we're branching into radiation oncology and neurology with that because that's where that kind of stuff happens is in hospitals. So you have to sell to hospitals. But when you talk about mental health, this is a much bigger kettle of fish, and it's much more diffuse.
What would be the workflow for mental health? So like if let's say I go in to see my psychiatrist and they're going to be using Omniscient, like do I get a CT or an MRI, or like how what's the workflow for when I come in as a patient to the point that the psychiatrist is treating the underlying circuitry?
So there we've done I would say almost an equal degree of complexity of figuring out how to get that done and paid for. But essentially what it would be is there's a QR code or a website. So if you could either find it on your own, okay, that's one way to do it. And direct to consumer we think is an interesting vector. But the other one would be a psychiatrist says, hey, you need to get this test. They scan a QR code. You go fill out some stuff and pay for it. And then we route you to a scanner that's capable of doing this protocol, which is actually most scanners, but we have to have ones we have commercial agreements with.
What kind of scanner?
Almost any scanner in the world can do our tests. So what we did was we didn't want this to be something that could only be done on a 7T scanner at Mayo Clinic, right? So we optimized a lot of our AI to work with almost anything. Obviously, there's some scanners that are better than others, and you get slightly better data quality. And we aim towards those places, but we can hit scale. We can actually scale the whole market.
What do you mean by what specific type of scanner do you mean?
Just MRI. MRI.
An MRI. Okay, got it.
Yeah, it's all MRI based. Yeah, it's specific protocols that you have to do, but they're not something that's researchy. We don't have to do anything amazing. We just have to get the MRI to people to agree to do it and set it up, which is pretty easy. So then you get this MRI, it gets sent to our cloud, and then within an hour or two, you can technically have a report that teaches you all about your circuits, and then you can take that to anyone who knows how to read it, and it will actually generate a plan for it. You can actually even generate a plan on your own, but it obviously omits things like TMS or medications or CBT that may be hard to do on your own. But technically, you could generate a plan for yourself that involves things like meditation or things that you can do on your own.
Interesting.
What we've done. Our rule is that we're willing to try anything as long as it has evidence behind it. And so we've sat down and curated and collected enormous amounts of evidence for how to modulate circuits non-invasively. So what types of CBT work on what kind of circuits.
Interesting. And what's fascinating is that it's kind of like it provides a really interesting closed loop from diagnosis to treatment. I mean, just kind of a perfect example is like there's a company I know called Intercosmos. They're a subdermal implant for it's essentially TMS on the go, right?
Yeah,
and so
I think that's a great idea, particularly for maintenance.
Yeah, absolutely. Because so transcranial magnetic stimulation for the audience, it's a great approach to things like depression, anxiety, etc. without using medication. The problem though is that you have issue with adherence to medications. TMS requires the patient to get in the car and drive to an office once or twice a week, right? It's hard, and so I think TMS on the go or TMS at home is going to be a lot more efficacious. Sorry, you were going to say?
Well, one of the things, Omar, that's happened over the last couple of years is been increasing evidence that you can do TMS with faster protocols and do it multiple times a day, and you get the same basic results. And so that's become the big deal, which is called accelerated protocol. So we actually get our whole thing done in a week. So someone just comes and spends the morning with us five times in a row, and then they're done. And it seems to work pretty well.
Done. That's it.
Well, they may have to come back and have retreatments. That's where the intercosmos thing comes into it, or maintenance, because and also where implants eventually come into the picture. They're not ready for prime time, obviously, but there's some good examples of people getting successful results with implants. One of the things you think about is we know it's a rhythm issue. That's mental illness. Every mental illness is a rhythm issue at the end. And if you had a recurring heart rhythm issue that threatened your life, you would eventually put a pacemaker in or an AICD or something. So we just need to know where to put it. And RIP is where to put it. But one of the things, and this gets into the time horizons, which is when you start going out and trying to commercialize a novel technology, you have to think about all the issues of how do you get that done, right? Like, how do you go get a mental health scan done when it's not paid for at the moment by insurance? And how do you do that in a way where everyone's cool with the price and you reach the customers? And more importantly, what do you do with it when you get it? Well, that's an investment of time and actually a lot of creativity that you have to put in. And that's not something that the academia is going to ever pay for or do, right? So investors have to think about how do you build a new healthcare system, not necessarily to reinvent the whole thing, but build a little niche in there that works in perpetuity. And that takes time and takes investment. Mm-hmm. We're at the point where we think we've cracked the nut, where we know that the product market fit is good, that this is useful. We show it to psychiatrists. They think this is a phenomenal idea and they want to use it immediately. And that takes time to work through that, because I promise you what we started out with was not ready anywhere near. We had to spend a lot of time thinking about what would connectomics be revolutionary for specifically, and not just for putting implants in the brain, which may be 20 years off. How do we help people now?
Yeah. And because the issue of like mental health is such a bigger problem. And I feel like it's connected, as you showed in your graphs, like it overlaps with so many other issues, and so somebody who has severe underlying depression, right? It could be that that's directly linked to their poor lifestyle, health habits, all these different things. And it's kind of like what I like about this approach, and specifically, this is, in my opinion, this is how real and true precision medicine is to be used, which is to target the root cause. And once you take care of that root cause, everything else takes care of itself, in theory.
Well, and this is an interesting thing, which is a lot of medical AI, in my opinion, I've sat there for years at meetings and told that it's going to change everything. And we all kind of know that it is. But one of the problems is that the people who understand the machine learning don't understand what are useful problems. So, for example, let's say I go train a model to recognize a pneumothorax. Well, I could think that it might be useful to catch it slightly sooner. But if it isn't obvious to a radiologist or to the person who ordered the chest film, then do you need to treat it? Like, is that really the problem? And it's also going to be thresholded at the skills of the best radiologist. You're never going to get better than that because that's what you're training on. And so a lot of times machine learning approaches that just make a prediction don't solve a problem, because we actually want to know, well, how did you figure that out? Because that might teach us something. And those are the things that are more complicated, but they're more valuable, which is we don't want to replicate how radiologists look at MRIs of the brain for mental health, because they're not any good at it. You get a 0% success rate. We want to actually learn things that the radiologist could never do and use machine learning approaches to do that. And that's a very different and much harder path that it took us years to crack, but we've worked that out.
So moving forward, like now that you guys feel that your platform is ready for psychiatry, like in 2024. Well, let me back up for a second. How much have you guys raised to date?
I have to translate it from Australian, but about 50 mil.
About $50 million. Okay. And then you guys are currently doing a raise right now. When you guys close your current round, what is that money going to be used for the next, let's say, like 2 to 3 years? Is it to just really focus on building and developing this category in psychiatry? What happens to the neurosurgical route, right?
The answer is they synergize, right? So our view on it is making the test available is necessary. And it's not necessarily easy to go into a place and get an MRI scanner to do your type of protocol and do it efficiently. So we started with the neurosurgical business because we wanted to be in hospitals, because that's where a lot of care is provided. And more importantly, it developed us a very powerful skill of how to get one of these tests done and back to the person, and troubleshooting and all that stuff. So the neurosurgical business was setting the stage for the psychiatric business. What we're at the stage where we don't need more technology built. What we need is actually commercialization. So everything is going to be commercial scale up, and utilizing the existing progress that we've had. Remember, we're actually available in most major metropolitan areas already. We're already on the scanners to begin to push out this mental health thing and to also really teach psychiatrists how to do it. It's education. That's the biggest thing. No one I've met has told me that they don't think that there's some value in this. It's now the next step is how do you drive behavioral change? And that takes time. It takes time and it takes resources. We've done it. We've worked with people. We have people who are using this for mental health right now and people who are paying for it. We know that there's a market here. We just need the money to go out and do that.
Got it.
And the time to really hit our maturity. But if you get down to it, the TAM that we're chasing is enormous, right? Because if you believe that the brain circuits, and most people do, including the National Institutes of Mental Health, the brain measuring and studying brain circuits are going to be a useful tool for really tackling mental health in an objective way, then this is running that on 20% of the population on a regular basis. And however you commercialize that, that's going to be a big deal. And we kind of own the IP space there. So we think that given enough time, we're going to be huge because we think it's just the most important problem that society's facing.
Got it.
We figured out how to commercialize that.
Got it. Fantastic. Well, Dr. Sughrue, I really appreciate you coming on. Just kind of like wrap up, I always do like some rapid fire questions. These are sort of fun. You can take as long as you want of them or answer them as quickly as possible, but kind of fun questions. But first question to you is like, there's a lot of podcasts out there. When you're, driving the car, going on a walk or something, is there any specific podcast that you've been enjoying lately?
Oh, to be honest, I'm a technological phobe in some ways.
Really?
I tend to adopt. Yeah, not that I'm a phobic to it, but it just I'm very, very stuck in my ways, and so I haven't really gone podcasting that much, to be truthful.
That might be a good segue to my next question. So do you read books?
All the time, voraciously, yeah. That's
perfect.
So
yeah. Great question as I sit in my library. So like my next question to you is like, what book do you feel like you gift to other people most often?
Depends who they are, right? So if
that's what I say, dang it. That's what I say.
Yeah. So like for example, for people who are working in my group, my research group, I give them Networks of the Brain by Olaf Sporns, which I think was an amazing technology book that really changed how I thought about the brain. And there's very few things I say that about, but it really forced me to rethink what I was doing. This is a few years ago. But if I gave that to the normal person, that wouldn't be the book that I would say really changed my thinking. But if it's someone who is talking about how do I run an organization better, I think you can't beat good to great because it challenges some of your assumptions about what really works. So a good one and good to great that I thought was fantastic was the idea that they thought that these places to work would always be these great places to work. Like Disney would be this place that everyone loved working at, or Nordstrom's or 3M or whatever. And they said, no, it's a great place to work for certain people. If you want to entertain children, that's what you really want. It's the best place possible. But if you don't, everyone else has drunk the Kool-Aid, so you're going to hate it here. And I feel like that's something that that's been missed in the kind of, Silicon Valley culture thing, is that you really want the right people working for you, right? So, in neurosurgery, we don't try to convince everyone to be a neurosurgeon because most people shouldn't do that job, right? It's too hard. You're not going to enjoy it if you're not really, but if you saw the brain and you said, this is the only thing I can do in my life, then yeah, you should do it. If you're the right person, it's a phenomenal job. It's wrong for most people. And I feel like when we build good businesses, our business, you have to believe that you really are here to change the world, and that's not bullshit. Because ultimately, we're a hard company to work for because we demand people that are going to come in here and tackle some of the hardest problems in the world. And I think that that's one of the things that's very valuable, is that you really want to make a business that's good to work at for the people who should be working at it, and not necessarily turn everything into playtime. And I think that's something that's very, very valuable. There's also a book called Talent is Overrated I read a while back, and it was the concept that one of the things they brought up was that Tiger Woods, they watched him practice, and he didn't go in there and just hit off the tee 900 times. He would throw it in the bunker and step on it and then try to hit it out. And he was the only person in the world that could make that very difficult shot. So it wasn't that practice made perfect, it's that punishing practice made perfect. And it makes sense in neuroscience. You're not going to allocate a new part of your brain by repeatedly doing something forever. You're going to do it by going into something that's uncomfortable and learning something new. That's how you carve out new space on the cortex. And I think that's really insightful, that it isn't about doing something a billion times, because then you're just going to be good at that one thing. The way to really become excellent is to push into spaces that you're not normally accustomed to. And I think that as we begin to get into this world of increased comfort and increased specialization, it's worth telling people that you're only going to grow by going into things you don't know. Like I learned a lot starting a business that I know now. I talk different. And so, I wouldn't have learned that by just going reading some MBA books. I did it by going to the School of Hard Knocks and, having business people teach you how to think like a business person. And that improved my ability to think as a neurosurgeon of how do you organize groups of people to get things done. And what are the things that are bad ideas that don't work? They seem like they would, but they don't. And I feel like in medicine, a lot of times we're taught that business, you shouldn't think about money because you're here to do the right thing. And I think that you shouldn't do things that you otherwise wouldn't do to human beings for money. But no money, no mission. So if someone doesn't find a way to make this practice solvable, then we won't really be able to take care of people. And I think that what's been lost in a lot of this anti-industry angle in medicine, where they've tried to rule back conflicts of interest, is that they've turned it into almost like, I don't know, witch trial or something, where if you work with Medtronic, you must be a horrible person. Well, no, we want Medtronic to make products that help us, right? And you shouldn't be taking money just for doing your normal job as a kickback, right? That's what we should crack down on. The way to measure that is not to ostracize industry. It's to make sure that we really hold people accountable who abuse that system. And more importantly, let's think about how do we have working relationships that, again, what's holding mental health back is money more than anything. If you bring money into that system, magic will happen for mental health care. We need to we all know we need to do that. So how do we make sure that system is funded correctly? So the whole concept of the cash pay angle is, well, guess what? A lot of more people will get treated and they'll probably get better care. And you'll decompress the part of the system that's the fallback for the people who lack that resource. So it actually, bringing money into that can often be helpful. We shouldn't be greedy. We shouldn't do, pseudoscience, but someone will fill that gap. And it's better that it's people like us who actually have ethics behind our business than people who don't.
Yeah, no, and I'm so happy you said that, because I do agree, like to some extent, like, working with industry or taking money has been seen as like witchcraft. But like for me, like if you're a physician and you have really good domain knowledge and you're able to provide like valuable feedback to improve a product that's going to improve like patient care, and you're able to help drive, because, driving behavior change and adoption of products is really hard. Like physicians are, for the most part, educated to be followers. Like if you don't follow practice, like you can kill somebody and you'll be ostracized, right? So to really encourage that change in behavior, it takes a lot of risk, takes a certain type of person. And I think, nothing makes me happier than seeing physicians who are paid a lot of money by industry, who've actually put in work where you're like, yeah, this couldn't have happened any other way. I think you said it the right way, which is people who are getting kickbacks for just doing their normal job, that shouldn't happen. But if you're actually providing like valuable and tangible insights and feedback and guidance to make products better, to drive, change of practice, like you should be compensated for that. And especially these days, like here in the US, like it's not like when my dad was practicing surgery, like, being a physician is really hard these days. It's harder than ever. You're not paid as much either. And so I'm very pro, like, if a physician's good, they should make money and make a lot of it. I'm very okay with that.
Well, I think the other thing too is there's ways to handle it, right? So if I get up and give grand rounds at Harvard or whatever, I don't go give a sales pitch, right? I might mention that this is what led us to come up with this thing. Then I move on. I talk about my science, my research. And by the end of that, if you don't understand why you should probably use what we're using, then I haven't done a very good talk. I'll make it obvious why brain networks are important, why I came to the same conclusion. And that's how you manage conflicts of interest, right? You say, I'm not going to give you a sales pitch, but I'm also going to convince you that I'm right. And I'm going to do it because I'm just going to talk about the science behind this, because it's legitimate, it's real. And I feel like that's the challenge, is what instead of having these binary things where you say, we keep industry out of here because we're this temple of goodness, you say, let's make sure that we... Oh, it's totally true. And
no, you're right. I'm laughing because you're right. That's exactly the point. We're a temple of goodness,
it's absolutely the case. And having been on both sides of the fence, I've seen it both different ways. I've seen it, one of the things I think about it is that it's one of the things in medicine that is often the case. And I feel like as a CMO, I've always had to try to keep this out of our own company, but it's an interesting analogy. So if you go into I'll take a diversion into history, but if you go into how the monastic order developed, how did monks happen, where people are celibate men who live off from everyone else and pray all the time? Well, it turned out that in the early church, before Constantine, and it was illegal to be a Christian, and the Romans didn't care about that per se, as long as you were willing to worship Jupiter as well. So as long as you did the sacrifice, Jupiter didn't give a shit whether you believed in it. But the Christians wouldn't do that because it's part of the Ten Commandments. Don't worship other gods. So they wouldn't do that. So there's all these people who went out of their way to get martyred because they wanted to prove they were super Christian. So they have records of people, asking people, please stop telling us we don't want to kill you, but we have to. It's the law if you don't stop doing this. And then people insisting to be martyred. Well, after it became legal, you couldn't get yourself martyred, right, by just being a Christian. So people went off into the deserts and around, Alexandria or whatever, and started their own ways of denying themselves care to show how devoted they were to God. And what it shows is a psychology. The psychology is when you say something is really good and important, there are people who will go beyond that to prove something. And so you see this in medicine all the time where, I say we should follow the rules, but don't follow the non-rules. And so the idea, like when people talk about patient safety, well, everyone wants to be the most safe person. And what ends up happening is they actually get in the way of patient safety in many cases, because what they do is we're going to spend so much time litigating whether that consent actually says right versus left the right way, that we're not actually going to focus on the fact that the patient's about to fall off the bed. And that I've seen that so many times where people have gone way above and beyond to virtue signal their, great. And that what they actually do is they get in the way of the pragmatic things that actually matter. And so, and where this comes from a lot of times is if you don't understand the principle, like what are we trying to not do? And how can we use rational thought to make sure we don't do it? Then what happens is you get dominated by virtue signals, and it prevents that real care from happening in hospitals. It prevents technological advancing. It prevents, really useful relationships between academia and industry because there's too many lawyers involved who just say don't do anything. And it hurts us. It hurts us as a specialty. It hurts us as a field. Right? And so I think what we have to do is recognize virtue signaling when we see it and call it out and point out that this is what the IRB is supposed to do, and this is what they're not supposed to do. That's not. But I think that what everyone can get on board with is the idea that we should, to me, it terrifies me to think that there's people out there who are potentially could be curing glioblastoma who are basically not given an education to get to that point in life. And I think the best example of that is Ramanujan, which is some guy who almost starved to death in Punjab and then ended up writing theories that people are still working on in math. And I feel that is, we need to focus on tangible results on that. And I think that we also, there's an interesting one about, someone talked about this at a neurosurgery meeting, and I thought it was great, which was, is neurosurgery have systemic racism? And of course we all said, no, we're not. I've never seen that. And it's true. People go out of their way to try to bring people of color through the neurosurgery. In my experience, we really want to do that. But then what they said is, yeah, but everyone's putting the same people. The people you're trying to bring through this are the people that would be fine in any situation. And if you really want to actually make a difference, you need to find the people who basically are grittier, but don't have necessarily the same test scores. But if you take them and drag them up, they will absolutely rise to the bar. They just haven't had that opportunity. If you're not actively doing that, you're just giving somebody who's unquestionably stellar, who would have been fine in 1950s Alabama.
Like a Ben Carson, for example. Ben Carson's a good example. Yeah, exactly. Like that guy was going to be successful no matter what.
Yeah, and that's the thing. There's lots of examples of that where you say, I've met plenty of them, where you look and say this person would be great in any situation, but you're not actually addressing the fact that maybe there's someone who is really good, but didn't have parents who were superstars, or they had average parents and they grew up with less advantage. We need to give those people mentorship and drag them up, and that's harder because the other guy is easy for us to train because he's going to be fine no matter what we do. I think that's a really valuable lesson that when we talk about that we have to address in this situation.
I totally agree. Because test scores only tell you so much, right?
And that's not, that's not solved on Twitter. That's solved by doing stuff in the real world.
No, I totally agree. And again, like as somebody who, went through part of medical school system, there are people, let's just put it this way. There are surgeons I know who are like double board certified. They probably got, top 1% on their step 1 exams and everything. I wouldn't let them open a can of tomatoes, let alone do surgery on a loved one of mine, right? And so I think like the harder part is like, how do you find those people who are grittier, who may not have the test scores, but you evaluate them on some different format and say, if we drag them up, they're going to do really, really well,
Oh, I think that's, the answer is ultimately this, right? Objective numbers are helpful for getting a gauge of where someone's at. And often a lot of times people who are outstanding really are outstanding. But to be honest, I found that almost everything that matters in neurosurgery when the dust settles, because, after 7 years of doing the same thing, if you have a basic skill sets and competence when you walk in the door, we can make you into a product that will work.
Would you be pro going pass fail system on step 1 and step 2?
I think step 1 is the fact that we ever went on, took scores into consideration was stupid, right? I mean, the answer that has.
I love you for that one. I ended up dropping out before taking step 1, but I remember thinking like, this is just it's like the father, like the I don't know, the step sibling of the MCAT or something. I'm just like, why does this matter?
Well, and the difference is this: the MCAT, and you want to think about it, right? The MCAT was designed specifically as a test to figure out how you could get into, get through the first 2 years of med school. That's it. Now, doesn't tell you you're gonna be a good doctor, but they do. There's a rationale behind it, and they spent time thinking about it. Step 1 is not designed as that. Step 1 is designed as a test to do you know X or Y. And it's actually designed specifically to keep foreign medical grads out of the country. Step 1 specifically, because it's hard to, if you're a doctor in Nigeria, I don't care how smart you are, it's hard to go back and remember all the basic science stuff.
Yeah, no, seriously.
Every detail. Yeah. Especially since it will probably change since you learned it. So it's a great barrier. That's what it's designed as. So, but that has nothing to tell you like someone's ability to be a neurosurgeon. I mean, luckily neurosurgery never got into that much. Like neurosurgery is the same.
I guess because you have such a long, like for people who don't know, like the two longest, maybe not, I don't want to say that they're the most brutal, but definitely the longest residency is like neurosurgery and cardiac surgery, because it's like 7-8+ years. So like most people don't want to sign up for that,
Well, and that's the thing, right? The point of it is that at the end of the day, all that really matters is attitude. If you really care, really do, not just that you're a pleasant person to be around. I'm talking about that you go to the lab on the weekends and learn how to do this case because you really want to be good. That person will win every time if you give them the resources. And so the answer is, that doesn't mean that someone from a disadvantaged background has that attitude, but if they do, they're going to kick the shit out of anyone. You run that experiment long enough, they will kick the shit out of anyone who doesn't care, no matter how smart or talented. And the reason is because, at the end of the day, a lot of it's getting back on the horse when you have a bad outcome and putting in effort when you don't have to, that makes the difference. Staying a little bit later to make sure you really stop all that bleeding. And being willing to do a hard case because someone needs to do it, not because it pays. Those kind of things are, cannot be assessed by any test. They can only be assessed by working with someone in the real world and looking deep into their character and saying, who are they? And that's why in neurosurgery, we've always had this thing of taking a year off and working with neurosurgeons, because then we'll get a better sense of that. Having letters from people who really met you, said, yeah, this guy's a good guy or girl or whatever. And the issue with it is, and research, because why? It takes effort. It's not easy to do it, and it isn't part of your training inherently. So people who put in extra effort to do that probably are harder worker and want it more. And you look at it and say, those things matter. Everything else, it doesn't matter so much. It doesn't matter that you're really good at the prep cycle.
I love it, man. Dr. Sughrue, look, it was such a blast having you back on. I'm sure we're gonna have you back on. Our audience likes episodes like this. So that being said, I'm going to drop in the show notes how they can find you. I know you're active on LinkedIn. Are you at all on Twitter?
No, I actually recognized Twitter for what it was when I first saw it, and it's interesting. So taking a digression, and I think it's worth anyone who's interested in this kind of thing should focus on it. Which is, I became familiar with Marshall McLuhan when he would because he had a cameo in Annie Hall, which is one of my favorites.
Yes, and by the way, just the bookcase right behind me, I have a bunch of Marshall McLuhan like first editions. Yeah, big fan of Marshall McLuhan. For those who don't know, Marshall McLuhan is the technologist who came up with the saying, "The medium is the message." But please continue.
And so for a while I heard that and that saying, and I didn't understand the medium is the message until very recently. There was a really good, I think it was Atlantic or New York Times, I forget, but there's a good article on it. And what they were talking about is there's only a finite number of ways that a media methodology interacts with the human brain. And what that guarantees is that certain formats work and certain formats don't work. So television has certain formats that work and most things don't work in television. Right? And we know what they are. We know what sort of things because they tried it out and this is what works, right? So like, people reading monologues doesn't work well on television, even though early television had that. They don't have that anymore. Whereas they work on radio. Right, talk radio has a different format. It tends to be anger and Christian right stuff. Those are the two things that seem to work on there. And shock jocks that works. So with Twitter, I looked at it and said, I remember when I first saw it, I thought 140 characters. This is just going to be a way for people to have trolls and angry retorts to people. And man, did I nail that one from the beginning. So I'm on Twitter, but I'm not actively involved in it just because it just never has appealed to me.
More of a LinkedIn guy like me, huh?
I talk too much and have too much detail that for 140 characters.
They did expand the character limit, but like it's still very much like short form. You can copy paste like a long form LinkedIn message or LinkedIn post on Twitter now, and it just has like see more. But I mean, people are used to it to be 140 characters, and I think that's kind of like the focus.
I see the place that I've seen where I think something positive happens is there are researchers who I think do a pretty good job of curating like what's hot and new, and this how people stay up on that. I haven't used it that for a way. That's kind of what I use LinkedIn for. And LinkedIn, occasionally I see someone like, oh, never heard of that paper. That's great that I have LinkedIn for this. But I feel like that.
Thank you for enjoying another epic episode of the State of MedTech. If you're feeling inspired and love this episode, do us a favor, hit that subscribe button and turn notifications on so you never miss an episode. And be sure to give us 5 stars and write a short review because that helps more people discover this amazing community of ours. If you're a company who has a executive that you'd like to be on the show, or perhaps you want to sponsor one of the episodes, shoot us an email at hello@khateebandco.com. Take care and we'll see you next time.